The new Chevy Silverado HD puts you in command. Own strength with its enhanced available Duramax 6.6-liter turbo diesel V8. Own the lake with its available advanced towing technology. And own technology with an available 13.4-inch diagonal touchscreen. The new Chevy Silverado HD. Own work, own play, own life. Learn more at Chevy.com. Find new roads. Chevrolet.
Greetings and welcome to another edition of the Agile Uprising podcast. I'm your host again, Jay Hersko. This week's episode, we have a very, very special guest, a guy I've been looking forward to talking for a while. We're going to talk about his book, Seeing Money Clearly, Using Throughput Accounting to Understand and Manage Knowledge Work. Joining us from, I believe, Montreal, Canada, Mr. Dan Doiron.
Yes.
Dan, thanks for joining.
Thank you, Jason, for the invite. I really appreciate it.
We are glad to have you. So, for those listeners, Dan has been posting this book. He was actually posting chapters through his LinkedIn. So if you weren't following him, you missed out. And when the book was finished, I was one of the first people nailing down Dan's door to get a physical copy because I'm a big reader and a big note taker. So Dan actually sent me one real quick, and it took me a bit to digest it. So here we are to talk about it. And we're probably going to end up doing, to our listeners, we're probably going to end up doing a second episode as long as I can find more of Dan's time, because there's so much here to cover. So we have talked about throughput accounting before, Dan. We had Graham Scott on, we had Clark Ching on. We talked about these things a little bit. But I think if you wouldn't mind, I want to start with a basic kind of like question, a lead-in question, where there's the idea of financial accounting. There's the idea of management accounting, which some people may or may not be familiar with. Our MBA audience definitely is. But then there's also throughput accounting. So how do I compare and contrast those three things?
Okay. Financial accounting, basically, for all intents and purposes, is what you consume as an investor, the published financial accounting that are mandatory by the SEC. They have to be published in a standard format and abide to generally accepted accounting principles. Management accounting basically is for internal decision making. If you take your financial statements as audited and try to make decisions internally for managerial purposes, you will shoot yourself in the foot, but that doesn't prevent most organizations from doing
trying to do it.
Which as early in 1916, those who started inventing the standards for financial accounting said, please don't do that. And today, as we stand, not a single word in all the thousands and thousands of pages of financial accounting standards have ever said, hey, use those for internal management. They never said so, and rightfully so. But anyway, that's another story. Management, throughput accounting was an idea, is the brainchild of Dr. Eli Goldratt from the theory of constraint. It's a lot of things. But Eli liked to compete on time. And Eli liked inherent simplicity. And basically with throughput accounting, as with all the other applications that he developed, he really hit the nail at the proper place to basically empower all of us to be able to make decisions at the operational level with three simple accounting variables. Delta throughput. Delta, can I make more money of this? Delta operating expenses, is this going to cost me more money? And delta investment, will I need to reduce or increase my investments following my discussions? So this is the delta world, the marginal world of decision making. Everything that you make, that you think you're going to make, always look at the incremental effect. And this is basically what throughput accounting is. It's also a full financial accounting system. It is a decision-making system. It is an improvement model, like the POOGI, process of ongoing improvement model of the theory of constraint. And basically, Every time you make a decision with throughput accounting, causality has to be involved. If you make a decision today, it has to have an impact tomorrow. There is no delay. Causality means you take a decision and the impacts are quick to appear. And this, as a side note, this is probably one of the reasons that I included in my book all of the flow principles of Dan Doiron, because all of them, each and every one of them, has a causality dimension to it. Dan Doiron is a big thought leader, and I found a nice place for him in my book.
Speaking of Mr. Reinertson, I am convinced, Dan, I'm convinced that is Principles of Product Development. What is it? Principles of Product Development Flow, second edition. I am convinced that is the one book that almost every Agile practitioner I have ever met quotes or references, and yet maybe 1 out of every 100 have actually read it. I'm convinced.
Yes. If you have not read that book and you have somewhere in your title, Agilist that, Scrum Master this, Center of Excellence this, just get the book.
Right. And I'm actually working my way through it again.
Every year I read it.
I listened to an interview with that Don just did recently, where he talked about how the best way to go through his book is read a bit and take a step back and think and let it and marinate, and how do I apply this? And it truly is brilliant. And excuse me, coming over a cold. It's not as hard to get into as one would think. So I want to build on that, Dan. So we talked about financial accounting, management accounting, throughput accounting. Early in the book, you give examples of flawed mental models, right? Flawed ways of thinking that we use that may be either antiquated or outdated or kind of just silly. And one of the first ones that I never thought about it this way until I read it in your book is the idea of labor as a variable cost.
Yes.
And how we talk about how knowledge workers, right? And I think about what I do, right? I am arguably a coach. I am paid regardless of how many widgets we ship. Our developers are paid no matter how much code they actually deploy. Yes. So we look at that as a variable cost when it's a fixed cost. It is what your cost for labor. It is what it is. Yeah. Why do we struggle with that, Dan? That breaking our head around that concept?
Well, we don't struggle because we still treat it as variable cost. Okay, so nobody has hit the light on that. So basically, in the 1920s, if you were to make a chair, Jason, and was truly not acceptable, I will destroy the chair and I will not pay you. Mm-hmm. In that sense, you as a laborer were a variable cost. Now, today, whatever you do, if you program and there's full of bug and you shut down the whole city, you're still going to be paid, right? So labor costs are now labor costs at the time were part of the total cost, and today with knowledge workers and the salaries that were paid, it becomes a really big dimension. And when you do your projects, and let's say you got if you treat laborers as variable cost, you will make mistakes in selecting projects all the time. Okay. And this is something that cannot be stressed enough. I was talking to you about the deltas, at the beginning, like the delta or operating expenses, or the delta this or the delta that. So Jason, I got news for you. You've been a worker for my company for 10 years and you're budgeted, okay? And sorry to say, but at the beginning of the year, you are not involved in any delta, okay? You're part of the operating expenses that I will have to incur. So if I have a project A, B, or C, or D, there's no point in me accounting for you in either of these projects. And if I do, I will make a big mistake. That's for budgeting, okay, purposes. I will make a big mistake. When it comes time to cost, okay, to take your timesheets and enter them in the system, that's another story. Project costing is also important, but in that time, you're just like any other one. You got to put your costs into the timesheets and all that. But if you do not mind that, a good 70% of your projects that you'll select or ignore will be totally for the wrong reasons.
Mm-hmm.
So labor cost for permanent employees and contractors that have been there, that are assigned for 5-6 years, are part of fixed costs of capacity. Whether you use them or not doesn't make any difference. Whether you put them on project A, B, or C, or D doesn't make any difference. Okay.
Right.
So stop account for budgeting purposes. Don't do that. If you have a consultant that you need for an expertise that is really specific for a special project, then you got to treat it as otherwise, as a variable cost.
Right. And you there was a line in the book where you actually said capacity is a flat line. We need to start thinking about it like that.
Yes.
And I thought that was like, it was one of those like so simple. I was like, the head slap.
Yeah,
reaction.
it's a flat line, horizontal, okay, not vertical,
Mm-hmm,
okay, horizontal. And basically traditional accountants and managers still fail to understand this. And it's a constant battle because I teach CPAs and I just can't get my message across. When I tell them, this capacity is paid for, use it or not doesn't make any difference. And they just have big problems understanding this.
It's got to be something in the pedagogy or how it's actually taught. So you just use an interesting word, Dan. I'd like to go in on that a little bit. You use the word capacity. Yes. And one of the things that shows up again early in the book, which I had never thought about this way, but I like how you call it out. The idea of there are 3 types of capacities in a system. There's productive, there's protective, and excess.
Yes.
So I'd like to explain this to viewers because I want the listeners, because I want them to understand. So we'll start with the bottom level, right? So the bottom level is productive capacity, which is mandatory. What does that mean? What does that mean? Productive
capacity, is the one that is necessary to basically for you to function and to feed the constraint. Okay. If you do not have productive capacity, you're basically not able to produce at your fullest. Okay. But for this productive capacity, it's the only one that lean and traditional accounting understands, because the other layers, which is protective and excess capacity, they consider those as waste. And if you try to level productive capacity everywhere, like a balanced flow, basically what you're going to have is chaos and mayhem as soon as a hiccup arises. Okay, and people just keep fighting on having level capacity, and they spend their whole time on this. And what the theory of constraint and Eli Gorat says, no, you're gonna have unbalanced capacity unless you want to fight it out and go to your grave. So you're gonna have to have unbalanced capacity.
Right.
So you need protective capacity above the productive capacity to protect the constraint and also to catch up. If ever something wrong's happen, you have then what is called sprint capacity, where you can basically recuperate from your hiccups. Okay. And then on top of everything, you have excess capacity. This is where slack lives. Mm-hmm. People talk about slack and give a lot of talk about slack. They think that the mere fact of lowering WIP will increase slack. It's not the case. It's not the case. It will hurt you more than it will help you if you think in that line of thinking.
Right.
And there is no, according to the theory of constraint, there's no organization that can survive or perform if it doesn't have that slack capacity. And everybody in Agile understands this and vouches for that and are flag bearers of this, but no one understands how it really works. Because people say, oh, I'm managing my Slack, I'm doing this to my Slack, I'm doing that. Well, Slack lives in and of itself without you doing a thing about it, as long as you have the proper productive, protective, and excess capacity.
And one of the, so to jump off that, one of the remarks you made in the book, which I wrote down because I thought it was interesting, you actually call out how protective capacity, right? So productive is the demand and protective is at the constraint. The protective capacity absorbs variability. And that for me was a big, like the mushroom cloud, right? An eye opener, because I never thought about it that way. But but the more you, and you actually later in the book, you actually walk through it. When you get into the Reinertsen section, you go through an example where that protective capacity at the constraint will allow you, and we talk about buffers at one point, it allows you to absorb variance in a system without creating just the wheels coming off. I guess the equivalent to our technical minded listeners would be, think of a tightly coupled system.
Yes.
Where if the components are not modularized and too tightly coupled, failure in one will result in a cascading effect. So that protective capacity absorbs the failure and or cascade elegantly, I guess.
It gives you a chance to basically what is called sprint capacity. If ever at sometimes a constraint has a hiccup and you've got to go faster than the constraint, this excess capacity will allow you to get to the market and preserve your lead time and your throughput. If, like all accountants and Lean, for example, believe that you need balanced capacity, as soon as there is a hiccup, the whole thing falls apart.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. And this is something that Lean and traditional accountants just won't understand. And Eli was very clear. The need for an unbalanced system in terms of capacity is essential for you to progress, because you only have to focus on that part of the system instead of focusing on every part. Focusing on every part is what people do, when to their own demises they fail.
And that ties to, I mean, you have there's a line later in the book about idle work versus idle worker, right? I've used that question numerous times, and it gets people to think. But to what you were just saying, you were hinting at, is when it comes to managing a system. Somebody used the term in a meeting yesterday, which I'd never heard before. Have you ever heard the term, Dan, bike shedding?
No.
So it's a term, and what it's meant to represent is people will spend an inordinate amount of time on the smaller things that don't make much of a difference. And the term comes from, you and I are part of a project that's building a nuclear reactor. And over experience, it's another flavor of Parkinson's law, where we will spend an inordinate amount of time debating where do we put the sheds that we park our bikes, right? As opposed to the nuclear reactor. And I thought that was really, really fascinating, the idea of creating that slack in the system. And where I was going with this was, you talk about, you want to minimize your managerial oversight. This is a big one here, everybody. Write this one down. You want to minimize your managerial oversight at the non-constraints. So this is why are we, so back to bike shedding, right? Why would I worry about managerial oversight of something that's downstream or upstream if the constraint is beating the drum by which my throughput is created, my profit is made? Who cares about anything else?
And my analogy to this is basically U-curve optimizations. Okay, everybody's heard about U-curves optimization. They're fantastic at the constraint. Everywhere else, they fail. You see, and the way we've been born is to use U-curve optimization for this, for that, for that, for this. It's fine at the constraint. The constraint has to be humming and be non-interrupted and work at full throttle. The other parts of the system have slack. And if you use U-curve optimization anywhere else but at the constraint, you are shooting yourself in the foot. So when you're not at the constraint, just don't start coming up with metrics. They're going to be bad in terms of resource utilization and all of that. So don't go that way. Let people work, and when they don't have work, idle time is fine.
So speaking of idle time, we're going to bounce around a bit. There's a diagram. I think it was on page 47. And for those listeners, Dan actually sent in some slides with some of the examples of pictures. I'll post them into the show notes so you can visualize what I'm saying. And for those that are familiar with the typical wait time versus work time camel diagram, Dan, you actually break it out numerically. What happens if I have a process that takes 100 days, 95 days of wait, 5 days of work? And where should I invest my money if I'm looking for a 20% decrease and 20% increase in productivity? And if you 20% of 5 is only 1 day, whereas 20% of 95 is I forget how many days.
Exactly.
I actually used this in a college class. I teach a class at Drexel University, and I brought up this example, the exact math, the whole nine, to explain how minimizing wait time is the most important thing you can go after. And literally, there were jaws on the floor. There were.
Yes.
I saw people writing, like drawing the diagram that I did on the whiteboard, because you put it in a way, Dan, where it's the best mathematical. I love math because math makes the argument for you. It's the best mathematical argument to say, look, this is where we gotta spend our money.
People think that the key to improving is to basically try to get more and more and more efficient and better at what we do. But by working less and reducing WIP, reducing the amount of inventory in the system, wait time is going to go down compared to touch time. And reductions in wait time are exponentially faster and bigger in terms of potential for growth and improvement. And people just have forgotten that. And every improvement initiative, the first thing they'll do when they step in, whatever, they'll try to tell you, hey, let's improve the way you work. Let's change the way you work. Let's do things differently. But the theory of constraint doesn't say that, and Throughput Accounting doesn't say it. Just take at what you're doing, very much like Kanban, and just reduce the amount of WIP in the system. Wait time will reduce, and then you'll see your problems more clearly, and your lead time and your throughput will automatically increase, And this is a lesson that Don Reinhardsson has told us since 2009, and we still have to apply it.
We're still learning. We're still learning. And regarding those solutions, there was another thing here where you said that accepting solutions that shrink lead time is a flawed mental model. So we just talked about touch time and wait time. Dan, what are we losing? What are we missing when we have this initiative to decrease lead time? What's the blind spot we're not seeing around?
Yeah. Well, lean is very keen on in terms of their improvement. If you reduce your lead time to the market, well, there you go. You're the winner. But let's say that you improve for your delivery from 10 days to 9. And if you're not hitting the constraint, at the end of 1 year, the only thing that you will have saved is 1 day, okay, on a sequential process, because you didn't hit the constraint. However, if you were to hit the constraint, okay, and let's say increase the process from 10 to 11 days, but reduce the time of the constraint by 1 day, then this 1 day will recur every week for the entire year, and you basically saved 52 days instead of 1. And it's hard to show and to understand without having a thorough explanation of this. But the focus on trying to reduce lead time by not impacting the constraint is basically what you're going to get. You're going to spend $50 to save 1 day, and at the end of the year, you've saved 1 day.
Right. So,
which is not smart.
Right. Why would we even think about that? So, so again, we're centered in the idea of theory of constraints, and you have a call out here about, the constraint is the drum by which the value comes through the company. And then you have there was a quote here, which I bolded and underlined in my book, where it said, increasing capacity by buying capacity should always be the last resort, especially at the constraint. Yes. So that goes back to cost being our earlier conversation, where costs are flat and capacity is capacity. Why is this so important, Dan? Because this is another knee-jerk reaction of the whole a baby in 1 month, 9 women, that whole analogy.
Exactly. If you increase capacity at the constraint, and you're basically elevating it, and basically it may no longer be the constraint. The constraint will change, because the constraint is always the place where you have the least capacity. Okay. Now, if you want to manage a constraint, the last thing you want to do is to elevate it. Okay. You want to exploit it. You want to identify it. exploited, and subordinated. Now, going after green money to improve, green money is fresh money that you would spend. It's money that you don't normally have. Is always an expensive proposition, because if you want to increase your capacity fivefold, you're going to have to buy 5 companies of the same size. However, if you want to increase your profit fivefold, you can use brown money, operating expenses that you already have, which will not be changed. And you basically identify the constraint, exploit the constraint at its fullest, and subordinate to the constraint. And you will get your 5-time increase in profits without having spent a dime of green money. You're going to use your operating expenses, which is there anyway, and which I call brown money. Brown money is familiar money. It's money that your top 10 customers will bring in, year out. Mm-hmm. It's also the money that you're going to spend year in, year out to maintain your salary cap and things like that. But green money is new money. It's the most rewarding kind of money when you receive it, and it's the most expensive kind of money when you got to spend it. Do not spend green money on initiative, an improvement initiative. Like all the improvement initiative movements are trying to sell you. Focus on the constraint with brown money, identify, exploit, and subordinate.
Perfect. I want to speak a little bit, Dan. I'm going to bounce around a bit. The idea of variability, special cause and common cause. So, and I might have you teach this back to me, because I think I followed it, but I want to get your take to make sure I understood it correctly. So, in the book, we talk about Reinertsen, and we talk about manufacturing, where in a manufacturing environment, we're all familiar with the term the andon cord, the cord that you pull to stop the line. Yeah. That is special cause variation. That's I noticed something, I want to all hands stop.
Yeah, and this is a way like the Kanban board will work. When you see something odd, you pull the andon figuratively, and you storm the board and try to figure out things. There is an economist that won a Nobel Prize a long time ago. His name was Lucas, and he had a line of thought that was called Lucas critique. He said that whenever you have something out of a model that works and you use it in a different context, you're falling into a trap. Mm-hmm. And basically, what we've done with lean manufacturing is that we imported a lot of things, like going to the Gamba. It's not necessary in knowledge work, because the one that's going to the Gamba in a manufacturing environment knows a lot more than the workers. But it's not the case in knowledge work, where I can't figure out what everybody else is doing. And so basically, we imported everything for special cause variation, and no support for common cause variation. And Donald Reinertsen has been very clear. And I read the book, 2009. He says, common cause variation have a much bigger impact in improving and reaching stellar profits than they do in lean manufacturing, because lean in manufacturing, if you're building a car off of a chain, the chances of you getting a cigars are pretty slim. Okay, so there's not going to be any surprises in that regard. But in knowledge work, you can get pretty nice surprises. And basically, what Donald Reinertsen says: listen, the tools that you work, the process that you have, the people you interact with, these are all part of a system that you can improve day in, day out. And it's not the case in the manufacturing, where the production change will never change.
Right.
And he says, so you got to pay attention to that, and you got to manage that. And we're left in Agile with nothing to chew on. And my book basically tackles a good part of this, saying that what have we done and where are we going? Because common cause variation is where the most significant improvements are going to happen. And this is where your system, Agile says, oh, there's complexity here, there's complexity there. Wow, complexity. Well, I'm sorry, man. But your software Oracle version 11 is not going to wake up tomorrow morning with a dress. Okay. So it just doesn't work.
Right.
The way you do things, the way you work, It's not going to change overnight, and there's plenty of opportunities lying around there to basically identify the constraint and milk it and mint money and improve.
I'm so glad you explained that, because that's where my brain got stuck. Special cause versus common cause, and it does make sense, right? And we know you and I had this conversation. We've acknowledged that that's some of the problems with some of the thinking in the agile spaces. We've inherited a bunch of lean manufacturing, trying to apply that to knowledge work. But eliminate your common cause people, and you're going to have a much better, the variation that comes out of the system. Like special cause variation is everybody gets sent home for a year because of COVID or something like that. Whereas common cause, if you can eliminate that, like you said, less surprises. That Reinertson quote is brilliant. And I am, for the benefit of our listeners, I'm going to read it verbatim, where he says, "So if product development is your game, don't think that going to a Gemba is going to solve your problems. It won't even identify them. Almost nothing that is truly important is visible in the physical environment of software engineering. Critical issues like batch size, overlap of activities, sequencing of events, margin of design, architectural partitioning choices, and risk management strategy are not apparent by observing the physical objects." I lifted this and quoted it verbatim when we had at my current role, there was a bunch of people talking about going and observing. And I said, but you're only going to see a team working in their their microcosm. You're not going to see what's really keeping them up at night, which is dependencies, constraints, all that stuff, like a batch size and too much work. It's not something you can see by just the local view. You got to zoom all the way.
But I took this view a bit further. I say, why don't you become the Gamba? Why don't you become the person that people will come and see for your knowledge?
Right.
And this is why I'm saying going to the Gamba is not going to work. Doesn't work. Doesn't mean a thing. But why don't you become the Gamba in knowledge work? Be the person that people will sought, that will seek your advice. And this is what I think the Gamba is, in other words. Be the Gamba.
Yeah. I'm sitting here looking at my God, I got so many notes here. So there was another thing you talked about. You talked about the importance of time, and especially in the and how managing time and thinking about in terms of time and not scope. And I liked your Ellie Goldratt quote, where he said he was competing on time because that time is the one resource we can't manipulate, right? And you actually have a quote here that says, variability will go quadratic with the passage of time, especially if you manage on the scope axis, as is the case for most frameworks, models, and flavors of Agile. And that was another one of those, hey, put the book down and think.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So let's talk about Scrum. Okay. You basically try to manage the scope. What happens at the beginning of a Scrum? You bloat your fish, and you have it go to the Scrum, the sprint, and then the fish is totally deflated. Then you jolt it with some booster cables. It's come full again, and then it goes. And what happens at the end of 4 days when your sprint is finished and it's a 2-week sprint? What happens? What do you do? Mm-hmm. What happens if at the end of 2 weeks you've got to go 3-4 extra days? Well, you got to kill that sprint, and the scope that was there is have to be recycled back to another sprint. And basically, if you take the scope analogy, I would take it as being a table of content of a book. Okay, scope can go quadratic. Okay, if you try to manage the scope, because it always changes. You know how it is. However, if you go on the time axis, Kanban is very good at doing things on the time axis. It has a problem on the intaking of work, because Kanban works from hand to mouth. We have capacity that was freed. What is it you want? A report takes 5 days, 95% of the time, and a CRUD takes 20 days, 80% of the time. What do you want? So you always live from hand to mouth. But they're doing it right in terms of competing on the time axis, because once that thing gets on the system, you will deliver it. There's no way that scope is going to get crushed. What I'm saying in this approach is basically instead of living hand to mouth, you can have like 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, or whatever, target scopes. Target scope will execute, will finish. Okay, they will go on the time axis. And when they're finished, they're finished. And then when it's time for another target scope, you just put another one. If it goes too long or not enough, or shorter or longer, it doesn't matter, because time has only one degree of freedom. Time goes in one direction. Doesn't go back, doesn't go left, it goes in one direction. And it simplifies everything. And Eli Goldratt understood this. And the way that he understood this is that Ford and Ono and Goldratt each understood that reducing inventory in the system was the key to having stellar financial results. So what did Ford do? Well, he didn't put any space in his warehouse and between workstations, so there was no place to pile inventory. What did TPS and Ono do? Small batch size, but they were all competing on physical things. Now Goldratt says, hey, I'm going to have a universal model and I'm going to compete on time. The time that it takes for the goods upstreams to come to the constraint, I'm going to calculate the time, put a buffer, a drum, and a rope. Okay. And he did so also. People will say, yeah, but how does that apply to knowledge work? Well, the PMI as their critical path management, project management body of knowledge, but the theory of constraint as the critical chain project management, which is far superior than the PMI, and it competes on time. Now, who uses critical chain? Well, engineers use it a lot, and this is knowledge work. And when people say that, Goldratt had nothing in terms of knowledge work, they're totally wrong. He competes on time. And
I got a question for you, Dan, regarding that. The whole critical chain project management. So I came up through the ranks as a project manager, learning PMI's critical path. And then when I learned critical chain, I kind of sat there depressed for a couple of days, because that makes so much more sense. And I think when we had Jack Vincent on, we talked about this. Why do you think critical chain has failed to get the absorption that it probably should? Because it just, everything I've read on it makes so much more sense than what we try to do with planning critical path and a giant Gantt diagram. Why do you think is it the complexity? What do you think?
Well, it is a bit more complex, but engineers dig it and engineers use it. Okay, so there's a big market penetration there that is not a problem for penetration of the market. However, Eli, and I don't want to criticize Eli or whatever, but Eli with Throughput Accounting had issues with accountants because he and Taichi Ono said accountants should be taken behind the barn and dealt with accordingly. And I don't know if Eli had the same attitude or speech with critical chain. I don't know that, but it could. But I wouldn't know the real reason why there's not a widespread adoption, but it is very, very much in use in the manufacturing and engineering sector. But it is in no way as prominent as the PMI approach would be.
Which is really a shame. And I actually did come across somebody who learned critical chain. I think they were in GE back in the early 2000s. And they said a lot of people struggled because it was conceptually more work. Whereas I forget who somebody said there are things that are easy to understand but difficult to master, and there are things that are difficult to understand but easy to master. And I think critical chain is in that latter. It's in that latter bucket.
Yeah. Critical chain is a beast of its own. Like everything. Well, I wouldn't say that, but yeah, it is a beast of its own. It's a beast of its own.
So it's a monster. Well, so we talked about green money, we talked about brown money, we talked about investments. One of the things I highlighted in the book is you start talking about the cash to cash cycle, right? Make more money now and in the future. And you talk about how we need to decouple throughput right? The idea of throughput from operating expense to pave the way to finance more investment, right? Which is called, I think it's called the TOE spread.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Dan, for those of our listeners who are around project program, balance budget, finance stuff, but who might not have heard of this, how would we explain that to them and to get them to think differently?
Well, the way to finance assets, I worked in banks and financial institutions for a long time, and when you needed new assets or whatever, you had to add a flag bearer project that had the money to basically finance those. Okay, and one of my friends, Glenn Menzies, once told me, "Hey, the first one on the bus pays for the bus," you know. And I thought it was funny, but it still creates a lot of anxiety as to, yeah, we need capacity, and how do we pay for it? Well, the secret basically, when you need assets and all of that, is to decouple throughput from operating expenses, because this is the way that you can basically get the green money that is essential for buying new assets, okay? Because new assets cannot be bought with brown money, you know, it's impossible. And the way that traditional accounting makes money would be to cut expenses. Okay, that's the easy way for them. You know, when you look at a financial statement, you have one line for revenue and you got 20 godzillion line for expenses. You know, guess where the focus is on that?
Right.
When you enter a throughput accounting world, what you want to do is always increase sales and increase revenues and keep operating expenses the same. So you want to decouple these two lines. Okay, and this is the secret basically to finding fresh money for buying new assets.
Perfect. Dan, we're quickly coming up on time, and I want to be cautious and respectful, but I do want to one of the last things I want to throw out is there was a quote in here that I probably owe you royalties at this point. I probably owe you 2 more copies of the book because I've used it so often, and now I hear other people using it. Oh, and your quote is, "The cost of decision making at the portfolio level defeats the purpose of decision making." And this is probably something that most of our listeners, I would say all of our listeners probably have in the back of their lizard brains, but they've never viewed it in that way. When I read that, I stopped and I went, this is why, right? This is the perfect example of why we need to, I mean, you want to use empowerment or any of that other, stuff. Get the decisions closer to the people who have to deal with the decisions, bring the work, decisions to the workers. If you think about the salaries of the people at the portfolio level, getting them to solve something or make a decision, how much money did you waste?
Well, not only that, but those that you invite to the portfolio meeting, because there's no discrimination as to who you're going to invite. If you have 25 projects, everybody comes to the dance. Now, they all have to prepare. They all have to get ready. And then when the time comes, who's red and who's not? And this guy has a budget of 25 million. He's tight on schedule, but his timeline is okay. And this one is for HR, and this one is for payroll, and this one is for marketing. Now, you have got to be able to bring these projects on a relative scale, okay? And this is what in the theory of constraint, the fever buffer charts are all about. They bring all of the project, irrespective of size, scope, money, budget, product owner, whatever, on a relative scale. And you can put them on the fever chart and basically know who's having scope issue and who's having time issue. And with these two relative scales appearing in front of you, you can see that there's 20 projects that are green on these two dimensions, and there's only 3 that are basically red. Well, just invite those 3. Let go of those people who basically those projects, we don't need to be there. God knows how much time it takes to prepare a portfolio review meeting. You come with all sorts of metrics.
Armed for bear. Yeah, you come armed for bear, right?
Yeah, you come up prepared, and then they're gonna spend time with someone that's both green in terms of buffer consumption for the scope, and in terms of timeliness, he's okay. He has a good haste pace, and you're gonna talk to him? I don't think so. So basically, you need two tools to discriminate among these various projects and know who you should invite and who you should not invite, so that the time can be well spent.
That is a perfect way to sum up this episode. Dan, we could easily go another 2 hours. There's so much in here. So I have beat the bushes telling people to pick this up. For our listeners, Dan, if they want to get a copy of the book, where do they go?
Okay. If you want to have the copy of the printed book, you can go to lulu.com or Barnes & Noble. And if you want a PDF copy, you can go on my site, agileagonist.com.
And if people want to get in touch with you, Dan, they want to follow your work, they want to maybe reach out because they have questions, where do they find you?
Well, on my site, there's a contact information. And just basically email me, and I'll be more than happy to entertain all of your questions,
Awesome. Dan,
and
thank you.
I also have training on my site.
I was going to say, you're going to start doing training on this, right?
Yeah. I started doing training both to CPAs and to Agile Centers of Excellence.
Oh, we'll talk about that off recording, because I definitely want more information than that. So, Dan, seriously, I want to thank you for taking the time to come on. This has been a pleasure. On behalf of Dan and myself, I want to thank all of you listeners for tuning in. If you like what you heard, hop on the conversation in Discord. I know I'm going to start another Throughput Accounting channel. Shout out to Machine Man Records and Krebs, their artist, who is giving us our fade out music free of charge. And once again, we're always free, and it's always going to be free. Sorry about the ads, folks. Some like it, some don't, but it is what it is. If you want to contribute to offset hosting costs, we do have a Patreon as well. So until next time, on behalf of Dan Doiron, right, and myself, this is the Agile Uprising podcast signing out.
Thank you, Jason.
Finding great candidates to hire can be like, well, trying to find a needle in a haystack. Sure, you can post your job to some job board, but then all you can do is hope the right person comes along. Which is why you should try ZipRecruiter for free at ZipRecruiter.com/post. ZipRecruiter doesn't depend on candidates finding you. It finds them for you. Its powerful technology identifies people with the right experience and actively invites them to apply to your job. You get qualified candidates fast. So while other companies might deliver a lot of hay, ZipRecruiter finds you what you're looking for. The needle in the haystack.
See why 4 out of 5 employers who post a job on ZipRecruiter get a quality candidate within the first day. ZipRecruiter, the smartest way to hire. And right now, you can try ZipRecruiter for free. That's right, free. At ZipRecruiter.com/post. That's ZipRecruiter.com/post. ZipRecruiter.com/post.